I'm not going to tell you what this is yet. Not because I'm trying to be clever, but because I want you to understand just how long I did everything right before I found it. So you'll believe me when I tell you how small the actual change turned out to be. I'm Frank. I'm 83. I mow my own lawn, I still change my own oil on the truck, and I took my whole family camping last summer without once worrying whether I'd have the stamina for it. That's not the life I expected to be living at this age, and it isn't luck. For close to 3 years, I followed every piece of advice I'd been given, almost to the letter, and my fasting number sat in the 150s and 160s most mornings like it hadn't gotten the memo. Let me be specific about doing it all right, because I think that phrase gets thrown around loosely, and I want you to know I mean it literally. I cut my portions. I swapped white bread for whole grain, then cut bread almost entirely. I took my metformin at the same hour every single day, set an alarm for it like a medication that important deserved. I walked most evenings, weather allowing. I read labels at the grocery store like they were going to be on a test. And still, 155, 162, 148, 171. Those were 4 mornings in a row from one particular week, food and routine nearly identical across all 4, and the numbers bounced around like they were choosing themselves. If you've ever kept a food diary that told you nothing useful, you know the specific frustration I'm describing. It isn't the frustration of not trying, it's the frustration of trying with real discipline and getting back an answer that makes no sense. A man wrote to me once, "Have been doing it all for years, still diabetic." And I remember reading that and thinking, that's not a complaint, that's a fact. And it's my fact, too. Underneath that frustration was something quieter and harder to admit, a fear that maybe I was past the point where effort mattered anymore, that my body had crossed some line where trying and not trying produced the same result, and all that was left was to manage the decline as gracefully as I could. That's a heavy thought to carry into your 80s, heavier than most people say out loud, and I carried it for longer than I'd like to admit. My doctor was decent to me, but she had 8 minutes twice a year, which is enough time to renew a prescription and not enough time to sit with a mystery like mine. So I did what I suspect a lot of you have done. I went looking for the missing piece myself. Here's the first thing I learned, and it reframed a lot for me, even though it wasn't the full answer. Your liver runs its own overnight operation, separate from anything you ate. Researchers who study metabolism and aging have documented that it releases stored glucose overnight to keep your brain fueled until morning. That part is completely normal. But as insulin resistance increases, which tends to happen more as we age, that release gets larger and harder for the body to clear. It's called the dawn phenomenon, and it explained why my numbers could swing even on nights I'd eaten almost nothing different from the night before. The liver, not my dinner plate, was doing something on its own schedule at 3 a.m. That was useful. It also, frustratingly, didn't fully explain my situation. Because if the liver ran the exact same overnight program every night, my numbers should have at least been consistent, even if they were high. Mine weren't consistent. They swung, sometimes 15, 20 points on nights where, as far as I could tell, I'd done the exact same things. Something else was in play, something that changed night to night, even when the food on the plate looked identical. I spent weeks convinced I was missing an ingredient. I went through my kitchen like a detective, cutting one suspect food at a time, dairy, then a particular sauce, then a fruit I ate most evenings. Nothing lined up. The swings kept happening regardless of what I removed. I even tried eating the exact same dinner 4 nights in a row, same portions, weighed on a kitchen scale, just to remove every variable I could think of. The numbers still swung. That was the moment I stopped assuming the answer was a food at all, because I'd just proven, to my own satisfaction, that it wasn't. You do everything right. You eat clean, you take your pills, and the next morning that number is still too high. I know that frustration. I lived it for years. They never tell you about the morning rise, your sugar climbing while you sleep, no matter what you did the day before. You wake up, you test, and it feels like the work didn't count, like you're stuck depending on more and getting nowhere. I was done feeling powerless. I didn't want to throw out my doctor's plan. I wanted something natural and simple I could add to it, something that finally moved that morning number. I'll walk you through what changed it for me. and the natural support I add every day is in the free presentation linked below. It wasn't an ingredient at all. It was the order I ate my dinner in. I found this almost by accident, reading about how researchers studying meal sequencing had tracked what happens when people eat the exact same meal, same ingredients, same portions, but in a different order. Vegetables and protein first, then the starch or carbohydrate last, instead of eating everything together or the starch first. Researchers have documented that eating protein and fiber before the carbohydrate portion of a meal measurably blunts the glucose spike that follows, likely because the earlier food slows how quickly the carbohydrate hits the bloodstream and how fast it's absorbed. The meal was identical. The sequence changed the outcome. That explained my mystery better than anything else had. Some nights, without thinking about it, I'd start with the vegetables because I was hungriest for those. Other nights, tired or distracted, I'd go straight for the potatoes or the rice because that was what smelled best coming off the stove. Same plate, different order, different overnight result. I went back through my notebook once I understood this, and it lined up almost perfectly. The nights with the higher, more erratic numbers were consistently the nights I remembered eating the starch first. So I made the order deliberate instead of accidental. Vegetables first, every night, for a full plate's worth if I could manage it. Then the protein, then whatever starch was left, usually a much smaller portion than I would have eaten reaching for it first out of hunger. Nothing else about my diet changed. Same foods, same portions, just resequenced. The first week, I didn't trust what I was seeing. The second week, the swings had narrowed noticeably. Not gone, but narrower, more predictable. By the fourth week, my morning numbers were sitting in a tighter band than they had in over 2 years, and for the first time in a long while, I could look at what I'd eaten the night before and actually predict, roughly, what the meter would say. I don't want to oversell one habit, though, because eating in order alone wasn't the entire fix. It was the piece that had been hiding in plain sight, and it worked best stacked with 2 other things I was already doing halfway. First, the after-dinner walk. 10 minutes, because researchers studying muscle physiology have documented that movement pulls glucose out of the bloodstream through a pathway that works independent of insulin, almost a second door for sugar to leave through regardless of how resistant the body has become. I'd been walking inconsistently. I made it non-negotiable instead. Second, I paid attention to how well I slept, because research on sleep and glucose regulation has documented that fragmented, shallow sleep raises cortisol, and elevated cortisol overnight pushes the liver to release more glucose, undoing quietly whatever ground the meal order and the walk had gained. I cooled my bedroom a few degrees and stopped scrolling my phone in bed. 3 pieces, working together instead of in isolation, is what held the improvement in place, rather than letting it slide back after a few good weeks. There was a 4th adjustment I almost skipped because it felt too small to matter. I stopped eating in front of the television. It sounds unrelated, but eating while distracted meant I ate faster and paid less attention to how much of the starch I was actually reaching for at the end of the meal. Once I sat at the table, no screen, and finished the vegetables and protein before even serving myself the starch, the portions took care of themselves. I wasn't hungry enough by the time I got to the rice or the bread to eat as much of it as I used to without noticing. These days I don't dread dinner the way I used to, half expecting to sabotage myself without knowing how. I cook for my whole family most Sundays now, 6 of us around the table, and I eat the same meal everyone else eats. I've just learned to eat it in an order that works with my body instead of against it. Nobody at that table knows they're watching a system at work. They just see a man enjoying his dinner. I think of Walter, 81, a retired mailman who reached out after watching an earlier version of this story. Diabetic for over 20 years, 3 medications, and, like me, completely stumped by numbers that swung wildly on nights with nearly identical meals. He'd assumed it was random, the way I once did. When he tried resequencing his dinner, vegetables and protein first, starch last, he told me it took about 3 weeks before he trusted the pattern enough to believe it wasn't coincidence. His numbers didn't become perfect, they became predictable, which he said mattered to him almost as much, because predictable is something you can plan a life around. What struck me about Walter's experience, and mine too, is how ordinary the actual change looks once you say it out loud. Eat the vegetables first, save the starch for last. That's not a discovery that sounds like it deserves 3 years of frustration behind it, And yet it took both of us roughly that long to stumble onto it, because nobody had ever framed the problem as a sequencing problem instead of an ingredient problem. We'd both spent years asking, what should I stop eating, when the more useful question the whole time was, what order should I eat it in? If you watched this whole thing, you're not the type who gives up. You're the type who keeps looking for a real answer. So let me be straight with you. The morning number isn't your fault, and it isn't just diabetes. It's the dawn rise, and it responds to the right daily habits. The goal was never to quit your treatment. It was to support it naturally so you finally see that number move and feel in control again. Alongside the steps I showed you, I take a simple, natural support every day to help keep my blood sugar in a healthy range. Affordable, easy, and it works with my doctor's plan, not against it. The free presentation is in the description below. Go see it for yourself. And keep your doctor in the loop. This is support, not a replacement. Here's what I keep coming back to. Thinking about the people my age who eventually found some peace with this, and the ones who kept struggling. It was never about who followed the rules most strictly during the day. Plenty of us followed the rules and got nowhere, myself included, for years. The difference was who eventually looked past the ingredients on the plate and noticed the order they went in, and who paid attention to the quiet hours between the last bite of dinner and the first light of morning, when so much of the outcome gets decided while you're too asleep to argue with it. It also changed how I felt sitting down to eat, which I hadn't expected. For years, dinner carried a low hum of anxiety. Would tonight be one of the bad mornings or one of the decent ones? And I'd never know until the meter told me. Once I understood the order mattered more than the ingredients, dinner stopped being a gamble. I could sit down, eat my vegetables first, the way I always did now, and have a reasonable idea of how the next morning would look before I even cleared the table. That peace of mind, more than any single number, is what I'd point to if you asked me what actually changed for me these past 2 years. Always talk with your doctor before changing your medication or your routine. What I've described here is meant to work alongside your treatment, never in place of it. Nobody should adjust a prescription based on a video, including this one. If you've ever done everything right and still watched the number refuse to move, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one, and I'd like to know if the order of your plate has ever crossed your mind before now. And if you want to hear more of what actually got my numbers to hold steady after years of doing everything right, subscribe, because there's more to this story than one dinner habit.